Hello everyone, thanks for joining our webinar this lunchtime. I'm Carla Whalen, a senior solicitor in the immigration and employment team at Clarkslegal. Our immigration work includes advising employers on right to work issues and providing support to organisations that have sponsor licences. We also help individuals to apply for visas and to extend their visas under the points-based system, as well as family and ancestry visas, and we assist with applications for indefinite leave to remain and citizenship. So I'll know, I suppose, a few of you on the line, and we'll probably work together on some of those things in the past. But what today's webinar is about is a little bit different, because obviously the landscape has changed a bit in Britain in the last few weeks, to say the least. Today we're talking about the potential legal impact of Brexit, with a focus on the impact on people from other EU member states who are currently living and working in the UK. So understandably, we've had a lot of queries and questions and concerns from people in the past few weeks, and I'm sure that those of you who've joined from employers and companies have had the same thing. The interest is really reflected in the number of people joining us today. So as I said, you might be watching today because you're a company that employs EU nationals. You might be having difficult, valid but difficult questions asked of you which you're just unable to answer. And hopefully what we talk about today will give you some tools for responding to those questions. Equally, you might be watching because you yourself are an EU national who are living or working or both in the UK at the moment. So what I'll be talking about today is going to be of interest to both employers and individuals. But unfortunately, there are still lots of questions we just don't know the answer to at this point in time. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a flavour of what legal voices are suggesting might happen and when that might happen. Things are changing on a daily basis just now, and it's difficult for all of us to keep up. Obviously, only this week we've seen the appointment of Theresa May as Prime Minister about 2 months earlier than anyone expected. And just last night, and indeed this morning, we got some cabinet appointments, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this webinar, although I don't want to frighten anyone off. We won't be talking about that too much. If there are significant developments, and as and when those happen from an immigration perspective, then Clarkslegal are going to be blogging about those on our immigration blog. So at the end of the webinar today, I'll give you the link to the blog, and you can, make sure that you're following that, and you'll see updates as and when they happen. So today I'm going to cover, first of all, free movement rights, now and in the future. So free movement, the ability of people to move between member states to live and work. Again, the focus today is on people who are already living and working in the UK right now. I'm then going to touch on the process by which Brexit is likely to take place. Specifically, probably Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. I should say almost certainly Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. We'll think about who's going to be doing that and what the timescales might be, with a focus on free movement rights. Given that there are so many questions still to be answered, I'm also going to think about what the legal commentators are saying and what they think the possible outcomes could be. What do they think is likely? What do they think is a lot less likely? And then in the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar, we'll look at the requirements for getting permanent residence in the UK as an EU national and the process for applying for a document certifying that. And to finish off, a brief overview of what someone needs in order to apply for British citizenship. Now, as we go through, there are going to be some poll questions to keep it interactive, which you can answer. And if you do have any questions following the webinar, then my email contact details will be on the final slide. So our first poll is asking who's joining us on the webinar today. So you should be able to vote now, and we can see whether you're voting. I should say it's completely anonymous, so feel free to express your true opinions. Okay, so once we close the poll, you should be able to see the results on screen. Okay, before we move on, we're just going to have one more poll for those of you who are employers joining us on the call, so we can get a feel for how many EU nationals you employ at the moment. Now, I know that for a lot of clients of mine, they just haven't been keeping an accurate record of this because obviously you've never had to. But if you have an idea of how many are affected, it would be helpful to know by just clicking on the poll options here. Great. Okay. So as I said, the first topic I'm going to look at in any detail is the future of free movement, I suppose. So free movement of people between member states means that EU nationals currently can live and work in any EU country without obtaining a visa or having an employer sponsor them. And that's one of the underpinning fundamental principles of the EU. So the first point that I do want to make absolutely clear is that there's no immediate legal consequence for free movement rights as a result of the referendum. However, I do understand that with a referendum campaign that put immigration up front as a key issue, people are concerned that it's likely there's going to be some serious discussion and debate, at the very least, in the coming months and years about the future of free movement rights. And both for EU nationals who want to work in the UK, and we should remember for UK nationals who want to travel to EU member states, and those who are living and working in other member states or want to do so in the future. So it's a two-way negotiation. So as at today's date, what do we know? Now, as you can imagine, I've had to update the content of this webinar on an almost daily, if not hourly basis. So a word of warning, if you are watching this webinar as a pre-recorded webinar, things might have changed. So as at today's date, we know Theresa May is Prime Minister and she's going to be leading the UK through the Brexit process. There's not going to be an early general election. We know quite a bit about Theresa May's own attitudes and opinions on EU immigration from her time as Home Secretary. So, for example, she made comments at the end of last year that EU free movement should mean the freedom to move to a job, so not to come to look for work or benefits in another member state. So could that signal a change in attitude towards UK immigration from within other member states in the future? Well, I mean, the answer is we simply don't know at this stage. What we do know is that she's appointed some key figures in her cabinet. We have David Davis going to be Secretary of State for leaving the EU, and Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary, both of whom were obviously prominent Brexit supporters. We've also got Amber Rudd as Home Secretary. So shortly before the referendum, Boris Johnson set out his vision, or should I say his and Michael Gove's vision at that time for what immigration would look like if the UK was outside of the EU. So Gove and Johnson said that migrants would be barred from entering Britain after Brexit unless they could speak good English and had the right skills for a job. In summary, I suppose, as widely was reported, they advocated what they were calling an Australian-style points system, where migrants from within other EU member states would only be granted skilled migration visas if they passed a points test based on what they do, their age, their language skills, previous employment, education, etc. But this was all pre-referendum, and as we know, an awful lot has happened since. So I think I'd exercise caution in looking back at what key figures have said in the past. One thing I can say with some confidence is that every voice I've come across in this debate, whether legal or otherwise, seems to agree that some generous provision will be made for EU nationals who are currently resident in the UK. And that was reflected in a statement that some of you might have seen this week on the government website, which said that when we do leave the EU, we fully expect the legal status of EU nationals living in the UK and that of UK nationals in EU member states will be properly protected. Now, unfortunately, Theresa May has so far refused to give any guarantees that people from other EU countries who are already here will be allowed to stay, in spite of increasing pressure to do so. I saw Sadiq Khan just the other day putting quite a lot of pressure on for that to happen. But the strong suggestion we get from her responses to this is that her silence is more about keeping this as a kind of bargaining chip for negotiations with other member states than it is an indication of her intention to make some change to existing residents' rights. So that's to say, in simple terms, the UK is not going to make any promises about other EU nationals living here until we get assurances from EU member states in return that UK nationals living and working in their countries won't be asked to leave. So obviously, European nationals not particularly keen on being used as a bargaining chip, but equally, silence on this point doesn't necessarily mean the worst. May is also concerned that guaranteeing a right to remain at this early stage for EU nationals in Britain right now might mean that there's an influx of people coming to the UK before any kind of cut-off date. So when will we or can we expect confirmation to come for EU nationals who are currently in the UK? Well, that leads us on to our next point, which is about what the Brexit process involves and what the potential outcomes are. So, when Theresa May spoke on Monday after finding out that she was to become leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister, one of the first things she said was, "Brexit means Brexit." So as a starting point, that seems to put paid to some of the optimistic talk about the referendum, after the referendum, about Article 50 not being triggered at all, and allowing instead more renegotiation of the treaties or of another referendum. I think there's going to be a debate in Parliament because following a campaign recently on whether there will be another referendum, but we at least know where the Prime Minister now stands on that. So what does Brexit is Brexit mean in practice? Well, it means invoking Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, and that triggers the timetable for the UK's departure from the EU. So David Davis, who we know is going to be the MP leading on the Brexit negotiations, has said he envisages Article 50 being invoked before or by the beginning of next year. I suppose heavily indicating that it might be a few months at least before that step is taken. So a few things to say about Article 50. It provides for a 2-year negotiating period, unless there's unanimous agreement by all the other member states to extend that, but that's not something the UK will have any control over. But a 2-year negotiating period during which the UK will not participate in the internal EU discussions or decisions on its own withdrawal from the UK. However, crucially, during that 2-year period, EU laws will continue to apply to the UK, including the free movement of people. Another few considerations before the clock even starts running on that 2-year period. Article 50 has never been used before, and there's some debate about how the UK needs to go about setting those wheels in motion from a constitutional point of view. So can the Prime Minister make the decision alone? Does there need to be a vote in Parliament? Does there need to be an Act of Parliament? Does the European Communities Act need to be repealed? And you'll be glad to know I don't intend to go into those constitutional debates here, but the point I'm making is that all of this is likely to take a bit of time, during which free movement rights will continue. And this will be key when we come to talk later about permanent residence in the UK and about applying for British citizenship. So as I said, before we look at those requirements, I think it's useful to have a look at what the legal commentators are saying about the possible outcomes. As you can imagine, lawyers have an awful lot to say about all aspects of Brexit. And for today, I'm interested in the thoughts they have and the predictions they're making about free movement and immigration. There's estimated to be about 3 million EU nationals living in the UK. And legal voices point out that there's currently no requirement to register or apply for residency when EU nationals come to the UK, so in truth, there's no way for us knowing how precise that 3 million figure is. But from a practical perspective, without even considering the legal challenges that could potentially be involved, the question that everyone would ask is, how can the government possibly go about contacting those 3 million or so people if they did want to make a change to their immigration status? Equally, if changes were made, how could they then check that all 3 million and possibly more had made the required applications under some kind of reviewed or revised UK immigration law? It really seems that logistically and practically the risks are just too great to conceive of significant changes being made to the immigration status of EU nationals who are already in the UK. For this reason, and for others, the majority of legal commentators that I've read believe that free movement rights will remain unchanged for EU nationals already resident in the UK at a certain date. Now, what date that might be, we don't know, but you can imagine it's certainly going to be no earlier than the referendum date, and quite possibly at some point in the future from now. For EU nationals coming after the Article 50 process is complete and Brexit has happened, we don't actually know what's going to happen. Some commentators think that free movement rights as currently exist will be incorporated into UK law, either as some kind of agreement relating to access to the single market, so in the same way as Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, or as an agreement with a specific country as a condition of a bilateral trade agreement, so in the same way as Switzerland, for example. Alternatively, it might be that the current rules change to make it more difficult to qualify for a settlement in the UK as an EU national. Or it could be the exercise of free movement rights is dependent on people working or having a job at a certain level or a certain level of savings or funds to support themselves. As I said, this webinar is focused on EU nationals who are already resident in the UK, though. So it seems like a good time to look at how EU nationals qualify for permanent residence just now. So it's time for another poll. And the question is, do you think that free movement rights should remain unchanged for EU nationals? Now I'm going to qualify that a bit because I realise it's not completely clear. I'm talking about EU nationals who are currently in the UK. Okay. Okay, great. Relatively overwhelming result there. Okay, second poll. For those of you who think it should change in the future, would you say that the change should be to the freedom to move to a job in the UK rather than being able to come to the UK to look for work or benefits, i.e. the change proposed by Theresa May last year that I was talking about? Okay. Thanks very much. So as I said, I'm going to end in the last 5-10 minutes of today's webinar looking at how you qualify for permanent residency in the UK as an EU national of another member state. And then lastly, looking at qualification for British citizenship and how you go about applying for that. So an EEA national who is a qualified person, and qualified person for these purposes is someone who is a worker, who's self-employed, who's self-sufficient, who is a student, or who is a job seeker. So if you're a qualified person from an EEA member state, you can apply for a document certifying permanent residence in order to prove you have the right to live in the UK permanently. And for most people, you need to have been resident in the UK as a qualified person for a period of 5 years before you can apply for this. Now, in the past, there hasn't been any motivation or need to apply for a document certifying permanent residence as an EU national, because your treaty rights, the free movement rights, meant that you didn't need to have any proof of residence. However, I imagine there will have been an upsurge in the number of people applying in recent weeks, predominantly to show that as at that date, they have been resident in the UK for at least 5 years, possibly more, but also perhaps because evidence of permanent residency is a requirement for applying for citizenship. So when you're applying for your document certifying permanent residence, there's a fee of £65. It's a relatively simple process. You complete a form which is available on the UKVI website, and there's a bit of guidance on there as well about how to do it. A lot of people will just do this themselves with no legal input and no external help. You post the form with the supporting documents showing that you've been resident for the required time. Now, as I said, for most people, that's going to be 5 years in the UK. There are a few exceptions where someone has retired in the period or something like that, but those are all explained in the guidance booklet available on the UKVI website. One thing to note when people are applying for some kind of certification of permanent residence is that if their ultimate aim is to apply for British citizenship, then they actually need to have been free of immigration time restrictions for a further period of 12 months before they can apply for citizenship. Now that's a bit confusing, but essentially it means that if you are an unmarried EU national, then you apply for your certificate of permanent residence after 5 years residency, and then you have to wait for a further 12 months before you can apply for naturalisation as a British citizen. So it's essentially a 6-year period. If you have already got 6 years permanent residence in the UK when you make your application for the certificate of permanent residence, I would say provide evidence for all 6 years and ask for it to be backdated for that period, on the basis that you can then apply for citizenship as soon as you get your certificate of permanent residence. So, as I said, a little bit confusing and a bit technical, but essentially, unless the EU national is married to a British national, they will need to have been resident in the UK for 5 years and then have a further 12 months residency in the UK before you can apply for citizenship. The difference if you're married to a British national is that you can apply for citizenship straight away after your 5 years residence in the UK. There's no need to prove that additional 12 months of having been free of immigration time restrictions. Okay. So finally, qualifying for British citizenship, which then obviously means you have a British passport and a far more permanent option. Once someone has permanent residence and as I said, in the case of unmarried people, after a further 12 months of being free of immigration restrictions. You can apply for citizenship, which is known as naturalisation, as a British citizen. Now, there are some requirements for that. You have to meet the English language requirement, and that can be either because you have an academic qualification, which is equivalent to a bachelor's or master's or PhD level qualification in the UK, and which was taught or researched in English. And in order to prove that, you need to apply to an organisation called UK NARIC. Again, information on the UKVI website. You can email us if you need confirmation of this. But you apply to UK NARIC, and they give you confirmation that your qualification meets the English language requirements. So there's a small fee of £125 to do that. Alternatively, you can take an English language test at one of the Home Office recognised test centres. And again, there's a list of the recognised test centres available online. As well as the English language requirement, you also have to have passed the Life in the UK test. And again, that can be booked online and costs £50. So if people are in a rush to do this, these two steps can be completed while their permanent residence application is also pending. And then once you have your proof of permanent residence, either for the 5 or the 6 years, if you need the 6 years, you can then get straight on with making an application for citizenship. And the fee for doing that as a naturalisation process is £1,236. And applications can take up to 6 months to process. Now, you can use a local nationality checking service to check the application and make certified copies of your documents, which means you can retain your passport while that application is being processed. You don't have to be without your passport for 6 months or possibly more. And there's a small fee for using that nationality checking service as well, which is about £50, but it differs from local authority to local authority. But essentially, I suppose what I would try and convey is that it's quite an involved process. It involves quite a bit of preparation, and it's also quite costly. So it's worth, if you are going to do this, or you know someone who's going to do this, taking the time to make sure you've read all of the rules and the guidance so you don't lose your fee. And if you can, take some legal advice on at least checking over what you have in as support, and also the way that you have filled in your application for naturalisation. Okay, so I think that's enough of me talking about the requirements. The last poll for today is, for those of you who are EU nationals, are any of you looking to qualify for either British citizenship or permanent residency now as a result of the Brexit referendum result? Okay, so as we said, a relatively short recap on where we are just now, where we might potentially be in the future, and what the requirements are if you do want to take action now to show that you have been resident in the UK for a period of years. What I would leave you with as a concluding comment is that if you are an EU national of another member state who's currently living in the UK, there is simply no need to take any action at the present time. Nothing has changed. You still have the right to work here. And if you are treated less favourably because you're a non-UK national, you might have a discrimination complaint. If you have been here for 5 years, you can consider making an application for proof of permanent residence now. If you reach that 5-year period over the next couple of years when the Article 50 negotiation is taking place, you can apply at that point. It's relatively inexpensive. It's a relatively simple application process. British citizenship is a much bigger step, a much more expensive and involved process. But if you are successful in your application, you will obviously then get a UK passport and British citizenship rights. Now, as I said, I've given the contact details for myself, Carla Whalen, and also for our partner, Monica Atwell, in the immigration team. I've also given, at the very bottom of this slide, the link to our immigration blog, which, as I said, we will update regularly with any key developments from the immigration perspective as we go through the Brexit negotiations. Thanks once again for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.